So to start, we're going to use the outreach trigger, which is one of those automated triggers that I described. Once you're in the canvas, you'll see there's kind of three main components to the builder. The middle area is where you drag and drop the connectors in, kind of build the logic there. So think of this as kind of a whiteboard where if you can think of how you want to build your business logic, you can essentially drag in connectors here to either take an action or API call to grab information or kind of update or create information in a system, or you can use it to build business logic using some of our core connectors. When you click on each of these steps, on the right side is the properties panel. So this is where you can start authenticating into your systems. You can choose which operations to use and also configure them in a way that you like. So for example, with the outreach trigger, you can watch for different types of actions. It can be created, updated, destroyed. So let's use and create it as an example. And you can also configure it to watch for various kinds of resources. So for example, a new prospects created, opportunities created, call. And in this case, we're going to use the call type of resource to watch for. So once we enable this workflow, whenever a call record is created, we're going to trigger this workflow to run. You'll see on the left side, there's three kind of main types of connectors. The core connectors is where you can build logic, kind of loop through values. In the middle is the helpers. So this allows you to very easily transform and map data without having to write code. And the bottom is our service connectors. So outreach and any of those services that we have pre-built connectors for, you'll be able to find that here. So let's do a quick search for outreach. What we're going to do is retrieve that outreach call and also get the call disposition and sync that into Redshift. So let's name this new call created. And we're going to get the call. So you'll see on the right side, we have an output of what this specific action is going to return to us. You can use this in any of the steps that follow. And so this one is get call. Let's say we wanted to, in addition to syncing the call details over to Redshift, we also want to get call disposition. We would just pull in another outreach step. Let's call this get call disposition. So now the way that you would relate information to and from steps and also how you would pass information to and from steps is using what we call a connector snake. So to fill in this specific field, I'm going to drag this over my previous step, which is get call. And you'll see all the attributes that are returned by that step. I can select that here. So call disposition, I'm going to choose that ID and be able to return the call disposition. Now let's say I simply want to create a new row in Redshift. I pull in the Redshift connector and just insert new row. So you'll find that to insert a new row, not only can you take data from the call step, but any of the preceding steps that were, I guess, produced information previous to this insert row, you'll be able to grab information from there. So let's take this and say call ID, call details, but also call disposition. So to map data into this insert row step, I take information from the call, give it the ID. I also want to get call details from the same step, which is get call. Let's call the notes. And then I can also give information from the call disposition. So let's say I just want the name of the call disposition, whether it was a good call, a bad call, whatever that happens. So this will be the call table. Cool. So just as a recap, what we did here was whenever new call is created, we get the call disposition, but we also we insert that into a new Redshift instance or as a row. You'll find that this is a quick example of how to sync outreach data into Redshift, but if you needed to connect to other types of data warehouses, We're not limited to Redshift. So as a kind of general automation platform, you're free to connect to any type of data platform that you'd like. So for example, if you want to connect to MySQL, Postgres, most of the common types of database tools that you'll see, you simply replace this step with Redshift with the database that you use. Additionally, if you want to apply business logic, you can manipulate your kind of workflow logic very easily. So let's say I want this to be call this position equals good. So I only want to sync good calls for some reason. I pass this into my call disposition step. And so if this call was a good call, then only if that is true, I insert that row. Additionally, the last thing I wanted to show was you can use a scheduled trigger to also sync data in bulk. So let's say you don't really care about the data in real time, but you want to use a more ETL manner to sync data once a day. You can use a scheduled trigger and get a list of calls. So instead of, just calls, I'm going to relabel this to say list calls. So now you can use our loop collection step to loop through each individual call. And again, you would just modify your workflow logic by dragging all these steps in. So to change from an event-based workflow to scheduled-based workflow, all you'd have to do is make that modification, and your kind of same business logic will follow, but it would just be happening in a scheduled basis. So hope that gives you guys a good picture of kind of the basics of the platform. So we have a question coming in about the date and time helpers that were shown in the previous slides from Dobie, and also how you would use that to query for results. So good question, kind of good thing that I kind of led to the scheduled trigger base. So date and time helpers, and as I mentioned, there are it's a whole helper section that allows you to manipulate and transform data. But additionally, you can use these to, let's say, grab data. Let's call this get current time. So you can use a function or an operation under date and time helper called get current timestamp. So this allows you to get the current time of this workflow run. And then you can use our data storage. So this allows you to store data, not just temporarily, but a lot of data that you want to pass to and from various workflow runs. So let's say this is get last runtime. I'm going to use get value. And the key is simply the name of the variable. So last runtime. So each time this workflow runs, I can get the last runtime and use that as a filter. So let's use the Redshift connector here. I want to get new rows. Now in my query step, I can either choose to run a raw SQL query, or I perhaps want to find rows and use the condition where last modified is greater than the last runtime. So you see, very simply, we can use our core connectors like data storage to store and get last runtime, but also use date and time helpers to update that and retrieve date and time values based on your workflow run.